She walked onto that stage with nothing. No family, no future, no child she would ever hold. She stood under that spotlight and told a room full of monsters every broken truth about her life. She thought it was the end of her. It was the beginning of her empire. The spotlight hit her face like a verdict, and Jenny Derrick, 25 years old, red and black uniform, white apron damp from a double shift, she had no choice but to finish, gripped the microphone with both trembling hands and looked out at a room full of criminals. She had been put there on purpose. Jenny Derrick opened her mouth and confessed everything. "I am barren," she said. Her voice cracked on the word. "I cannot have children. I have no family. I am completely, entirely alone in this world." The room laughed. Every polished, dangerous, expensively dressed man at every table in that restaurant laughed. Because cruelty dressed in good, shoes still laughs the same as cruelty in rags. Except one man. He had tattoos crawling up his neck like a second language, a black suit, eyes that had never once learned how to be afraid of a room. He was seated at a corner table, with documents spread before him and a glass of red wine he hadn't touched, because a man like Tae-hyun, boss of the Baeko-Korean syndicate, did not let anything distract him from business. She just walked out of the worst night of her life beside the most dangerous man she had ever stood close to. How does a woman with nothing become the judge, jury, and executioner of a global empire? It started with a spotlight, a broken confession, and a man who looked at her empty spaces and decided, with the full force of everything he commanded, to fill them. If you want to see how a terrified, barren waitress survives the most dangerous man in the underworld and rises to become his queen, stay until the very end. Subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this love story travels. Now go back with me. 6 weeks. Jenny Derrick's feet hurt. They always hurt by this point in a double shift, but tonight the ache was different. Deep, systemic, the kind that wasn't just physical. It was the ache of a person whose body had been carrying a life too heavy for one person for far too long. She was 25 years old, and she moved through the elite restaurant on Fifth Avenue like air. Present enough to be Jenny had worked here for 2 years. She knew exactly what this place was. She kept her head down, her expression neutral, and her opinions locked behind the smile she'd learned to keep on her face like armor. That discipline had kept her employed. It did not save her that night. His name was Marcus Webb, floor manager, the kind of man whose authority existed only because of the specific hierarchy that propped him up, who smiled at guests and scheduled consequences for anyone who challenged him. He had been at the restaurant longer than Jenny and wore that tenure like a weapon. Tonight, she would find out later, he had been paid. Paid by the American syndicate faction that had been feeding information to Ji-hoon for 18 months. Paid to place Jenny Derrick on that stage as an instrument of distraction while a sniper took position at the window across the street. The VIP section was full, expensive suits at every table. Quiet conversations that carried more weight than the noise level implied. Marcus Webb walked the floor with the particular energy of a man executing a plan, and when he stopped beside Jenny, when he pointed at the small corner stage, with its unused spotlight and its vintage microphone stand, she felt the air in the room shift. "Up there," he said. "Entertain them." Jenny looked at the stage. She had dusted that microphone stand 60 times. "I'm a waitress," she said. "Tonight you're whatever I need," he said back. And his voice had the flatness of someone who did not expect to be questioned. The room was watching. Jenny Derrick walked to that stage the way a person walks towards something inevitable. She climbed the 2 small steps. The spotlight snapped on and hit her full in the face. Blinding, harsh, indifferent. She reached for the microphone the way a drowning person reaches for anything solid. Her hands were shaking. The room below her was a sea of strangers who held more power in their dinner reservation than she held in her entire life. Nobody laughed yet. They were waiting. And something in Jenny, Something that had been pressed down and held under and told to be quiet for 25 years of being, told she was not quite enough, not quite whole, not quite what anyone needed her to be, broke completely open. She didn't perform, she confessed. "I have no one," she said into the microphone. Her voice cracked in half on the second word. "I can't. I will never have children. I have no family. There is nobody, anywhere, waiting for me. I am completely alone." The words left her and hung in the air over the white tablecloths and the crystal and the expensive suits. Then someone snickered. Then someone else. And then the laughter moved through the room the way fire moves through dry things. Low at first, then building, then everywhere. Except one table. She saw him through the tears she couldn't stop. She saw the table first. 4 men, documents, wine, and then she saw him. The one who was not laughing. The one who had gone very, very still. The tattoos on his neck were elaborate and dark against his skin. His black suit fit him the way expensive things fit people who have always been able to afford them. He was leaning back slightly in his chair with the physical calm of a man who had never in his life needed a room to like him. And he was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a word for, not pity, not amusement, something older than either. He stood. She didn't know it then, but she was about to step out of her invisible life and into the most dangerous one on 2 continents. And the only thing that would keep her alive from this moment forward was the fact that the most feared man in that room had decided, without warning and without reason she yet understood, that she mattered. The chaos erupted the moment Tae-hyun's hand found the small of her back. 1 second the restaurant was a frozen tableau of shocked, carefully beautiful faces. The next, men were moving, shouting, the sound of chairs scraping marble, glass shattering somewhere behind them, voices in 2 languages cutting through the air like wire. Jenny felt none of it clearly. She was still in her body, but barely. Shock had wrapped itself around her senses like cotton, muffling the world's edges, leaving only the immediate, only the physical. The warmth of his palm through the fabric of his jacket on her shoulders. The measured, unhurried pace at which he moved. The way the room parted for him the way water parts for something it has learned not to resist. He did not run. He did not flinch. He guided her through the restaurant floor with the calm authority of a man who had decided how this evening would end a long time ago. And everything unraveling around them was simply the world catching up to his decision. His men materialized from the edges of the room like shadows given specific instructions. 3 of them, suits, earpieces, faces that communicated nothing, formed a perimeter around her and Tae-hyun before she had fully registered they were there. One pushed the side door open. Cold night air hit her face. Then they were outside. The rain was coming down in long silver sheets, and a black armored SUV was already idling at the curb with its back door open, like something that had been waiting for her specifically. Tae-hyun placed one hand briefly on the top of her head as she slid inside. A gesture so practiced, so instinctively protective, that it landed in her chest before her mind could analyze it. The door closed. The noise of the city disappeared. The silence had a texture. It was leather, smooth and cool, against the backs of Jenny's thighs where her uniform skirt had ridden up from, sliding across the seat. The interior was dark and immaculate, every surface deliberate, the kind of clean that came not from effort, but from expectation. The windows were tinted so deeply, the city outside looked like footage she was, watching from somewhere far removed from herself. Rain tracked down the glass in long silver lines, and she watched them because watching them required nothing from her. Tae-hyun sat beside her, not close enough to crowd, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him. The unsettling warmth of a person whose stillness was not passive but chosen. He had his phone to his ear, speaking Korean in low, clipped tones, the cadence of final instructions rather than conversation. He did not look at her, but one of his hands rested on the seat between them, palm down, fingers relaxed. 3 inches from her knee, she looked at that hand. The tattoos crossed his knuckles, covered the back of his hand, disappeared up his wrist beneath his sleeve. They were not decorative. They were a record. Each line placed with intention, each symbol earned in a currency she didn't want to calculate. His hands were large, deliberate-looking, the hands of someone who had used them for things that required a precision most people never develop. Jenny pulled her eyes away and looked at her own hands instead. Her nails were cut short and practical, one broken clean from the double shift, the skin around her right thumb still faintly red from where she had gripped the microphone stand so tightly the metal had bitten in. She was wearing her uniform. She was wearing his jacket over her uniform. She had no bag, no phone, no coat of her own, no clear destination, and no fully formed understanding of whether she had been saved or simply repositioned. The distinction felt important. She didn't ask. The 43rd floor. The penthouse occupied the top of a building in Midtown she had walked past 100 times without ever once looking up at. The elevator opened directly into the apartment. No hallways, no neighbors, no transitional space between the private and the personal. Just the doors parting on a room so precisely and expensively assembled that it took Jenny several seconds to process that she was expected to stand in it. Floor-to-ceiling windows ran the full length of the far wall. The city spread below in every direction, blurred and golden, the rain bleeding the lights into long smears of amber and white. The furniture was dark wood and pale stone, and a shade of grey that communicated authority without asking for permission. No clutter, no sentimentality. A single white orchid on the dining table, alone in a black ceramic vessel, composed, deliberate, the only soft thing in the room, and somehow made severe by how solitary it was. Jenny stood in the entrance in her scuffed Waitress shoes. The left one creased across the toe. From a night she'd dropped a water pitcher and stepped on the glass with her foot to stop it rolling under a VIP table, and she did not move. One of Taehyun's staff appeared, a woman, immaculately dressed, who looked at Jenny with complete professional neutrality and informed her, in precise English, that a room had been prepared, that clothing had been arranged, that she should eat. The words were delivered in the tone of someone whose employer's preferences were not open to negotiation. Jenny looked at Taehyun. He had removed his phone. He stood at the window with his back to the room, hands clasped behind him, watching the city the way a man watches something that already belongs to him and is simply verifying the fact. "Rest," he said. He didn't turn around. 2 syllables. The full weight of a decision compressed inside them. The borrowed room. She didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the largest bed she had ever been near. White linen so crisp it seemed structural rather than soft. Still in his jacket, and she tried to assemble her thoughts into something organized. She failed. The shower she'd taken had required a kind of recategorization. Water pressure that felt intentional rather than incidental. Products she didn't have names for. Towels that felt like a targeted apology from a world that had never previously bothered. She had stood under the heat of it for too long, and then stood in front of the mirror for even longer, looking at herself in a way she rarely allowed. Dark skin still damp, natural hair loose around her face without the neat bun her uniform required. Eyes that looked older than 25, and tired in a way sleep couldn't fully fix, and something else underneath that she couldn't cleanly identify. Something that had been torn open under a spotlight 2 hours ago and had not yet closed. She was wearing borrowed clothes. Soft, dark, perfectly fitted. Someone had guessed her size correctly, which meant someone had looked at her with enough attention to know it. That thought settled in her chest, somewhere between unsettled and something she wasn't prepared to examine. She had her palm pressed flat against a small scrape on her knee. A minor thing, from the edge of the SUV door when she had slid in too quickly, when the bedroom door opened without a knock. Jenny went very still. His hands Taehyun entered, carrying a small black case, with the unhurried certainty of a man who did not require permission in spaces he owned. He had removed his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and the tattoos that had only been visible at his neck and knuckles in the restaurant were now fully present, climbing his forearms in dense, dark detail, deliberately placed, each one a word in a language that only he and the people who'd earned the right to read it could understand. The sight of them in the quieter, lower light of the room was different from across a restaurant floor. More personal, like being permitted to see something that wasn't offered to everyone. He set the case on the table by the window without looking at her. Opened it. Antiseptic. Cotton. A small bandage. Then he pulled the chair from the table, turned it, and sat directly in front of where she was perched on the edge of the bed. Close. Not threatening. Just close. Proximity that makes a person acutely aware of their own breathing. He looked at her knee, then at her hand. "Give it to me," he said. She held his gaze for one full second, the pause involuntary, honest, the actual physical sensation of standing at the edge of something with no visible bottom. And then she gave him her hand. His fingers were warm, dry. He turned her hand slightly to examine the redness on her thumb from the microphone stand, then rested it carefully on his knee and reached for the antiseptic without releasing her. The cotton was cold against the irritated skin. The sting was brief. He worked without speaking. Precise, efficient, focused in the way of someone who had learned to do this correctly because incorrect had consequences, and Jenny watched his face and could not read a single thing in it. Then he moved to her knee. He placed his palm against her shin to hold her leg steady, and the contact, just that, just his warm palm against her lower leg, deliberate and still, traveled the entire length of her nervous system before she could intercept it. Her jaw tightened. She looked away, at the window, at the rain on the glass, at the city below, completely uninformed about what was happening up here. "You cried," he said. His voice was lower in this room than it had been in the restaurant. Or maybe she was simply close enough now to hear what it actually was. She said nothing. In front of all of them. He pressed the bandage flat against her knee with his thumb, smoothing each edge down slowly. "And you stayed on that stage." "I broke," she said, quiet, factual. "No." He looked up at her, and the directness of it, the full, unhurried weight of his gaze finding hers, pinned her in place the way nothing else that evening had. Breaking is staying down. You confessed and you stayed standing. That is not the same thing. Jenny held his gaze for exactly as long as she could, which was not long enough and also too long. "I don't understand why you did what you did," she said. "I know you don't." "That should concern me." "It should," he agreed. No apology in it. Just fact acknowledged plainly, offered with the quiet confidence of a man who had decided the truth was more useful than the reassuring version of it. He stood. The warmth of his hand left her shin, and the absence registered immediately, like a sound that had stopped. "You said I'm not invisible," Jenny said to his back. He stopped at the door. Her voice was careful. She was testing something she didn't have a name for, and she knew it, and she did it anyway. "You said that, in the restaurant, before everything. You said I wasn't invisible, that I wasn't alone." The rain hit the glass. The city hummed. The white orchid on the distant table held its composed, solitary shape in the dark. "I don't say things I don't mean," Tae-yun said. "A beat." "Sleep," he said, and he left. Jenny sat in the dark of the most beautiful room she had ever occupied, pressed 2 fingers to the bandage on her knee, still warm from where his hands had been, and felt, moving through her like a slow current she could neither name nor stop, the terrifying particular danger of beginning to believe someone. She should have been afraid of him. She was afraid of him. But she was also, underneath that fear, in the raw place the spotlight had made, something else. Something quieter and more stubborn and far more difficult to defend against than fear. She recognized it, the way you recognize something you've never had but always known the shape of. And she understood, sitting in the borrowed clothes in the borrowed room above the life she had been living this morning, that the fear was not the problem. The feeling underneath it was. They left before dawn. No announcement, no explanation, just the quiet knock of one of Tae-Hyun's men at the bedroom door, 2 sharp raps, and then the understanding that this was not a suggestion. Jenny had not slept. She had lain in the dark of that immaculate room, with her eyes open, and her mind running circuit after circuit through everything that had happened since the spotlight, cataloguing each moment the way a person catalogues exits in an unfamiliar building. By the time the knock came, she was already sitting upright, still dressed, the borrowed clothes soft against her skin and Taeyun's jacket folded across the foot of the bed. She had not put it far from her. She didn't examine why. A bag had been packed for her. She hadn't packed it. That detail, small, specific, quietly absolute, told her more about the nature of what she had stepped into than anything that had happened in the restaurant. At altitude, the private jet was smaller than she expected and more intimate for it. Dark leather, low lighting, the steady meditative hum of the engines once they leveled out above the cloud cover. New York disappeared beneath them like a secret being buried. Jenny sat by the window and watched the darkness outside, and felt the unreality of all of it pressing against her chest like a physical weight. A flight attendant appeared, silent, professional, and set a glass of champagne on the table beside her, the kind with a year on the label rather than a brand name. She picked it up because having something to hold felt necessary. She took one sip. It tasted like a world she didn't belong in yet. Cool, precise, quietly sure of itself, and entirely unable to reach the hollow that had lived under. Her sternum so long she had stopped noticing it, until a spotlight and a stranger's jacket had cracked it back open tonight. She set the glass down and didn't touch it again. Tae-Hyun sat across the aisle. He had documents spread before him, a pair of reading glasses sitting low on the bridge of his nose, a pen moving steadily across the page. The glasses were the first ordinary thing she had seen on him, and the effect was deeply disorienting. This man who had dismantled a floor manager with 4 words and left a restaurant full of criminals in silence, now quietly annotating paperwork like someone with a deadline. The tattoos on his forearms caught the cabin light. Her eyes kept returning to them the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. Not for comfort, but because they were there and she could not stop herself. He looked up once, not at her, through the window. Whatever he was calculating resolved something in his expression, and then he went back to the page. Jenny looked away first. Soul, she smelled it before she saw it. Something underneath the recycled air of the jet bridge, warmer, older, a thickness in the atmosphere that New York had never carried. Then the arrivals hall, then the car. Then the city opened around them in the pre-dawn dark, and Jenny pressed herself toward the tinted glass and forgot, momentarily, everything. Seoul was enormous in a way that was not just size but density of intention. Towers of neon and glass rising against a sky still dark at the edges, the Han River catching light from both banks in long, trembling ribbons, expressways threading between mountains that had no business being this close to a city this alive. It was beautiful and indifferent in equal measure, and that indifference was almost a relief after hours of being looked at too carefully. The ancestral estate was an hour outside the city. The mountains arrived first, dark, forested, the road narrowing to something that felt less like infrastructure and more like permission. And then, through a gate set into a stone wall that ran in both directions, as far as she could track, the hanok appeared. It was not what she had imagined. She had expected cold opulence. She found something older and more serious. Dark wooden structures with curved roofs that swept upward at their edges like a held breath. Courtyards of pale stone, paper screens in distant windows throwing soft gold light into the dark, the smell of cedarwood, and something mineral and ancient that the mountain air carried from every direction. It was a place that understood exactly what it was and had never once needed to explain it. Jenny stepped out of the car and stood in the cold mountain air, and felt the gravel shift beneath her scuffed shoes, and understood, in her body before her mind, that she was further from anything she had ever known than distance alone could measure, the inner circle they were waiting inside. 7 men arranged in the main receiving room with the practiced stillness of people who had been briefed. Dark suits, carefully composed faces, eyes that moved to Jenny with the quality of attention that precedes a judgment. She felt it cross her like cold water, felt them reading her, the deep brown of her skin, the borrowed clothes, the plain face that wore no jewelry, no armor, nothing that announced any reason for her presence in this room, on this mountain, in any proximity to the man who walked in beside her. One of them, younger, angular, ambition still louder than his discipline, said something in Korean that she didn't need translated. The tone carried everything. The room shifted. Tae-hun didn't raise his voice. He said 4 words, low, unhurried, the cadence of a man accustomed to speaking at the volume that requires rooms to lean in rather than the volume that demands they flinch. Whatever those 4 words contained, they landed with the weight of something dropped from a great height. The younger man's expression rearranged itself immediately. The others found different places to rest their eyes. Nobody said anything else. Then an older man separated himself from the group, silver at his temples, a face arranged into warmth the way some men arrange furniture, unhurried and deliberate. He moved toward Jenny with the ease of someone who had decided to be the most approachable presence in a room full of dangerous ones. He inclined his head in a small, gracious bow. Miss Derrick. His English was precise, lightly accented. I am Ji-hoon. Welcome to the Baker Estate. We are honored to receive you. His smile reached his eyes exactly as far as it needed to. Jenny returned it with the precise, calibrated warmth she had spent 2 years developing on a restaurant floor. Pleasant, readable, offering nothing beneath the surface. Thank you, she said. It's a beautiful home. She was watching all of them. She had learned long before tonight that the most useful skill in a room that wanted to underestimate her was not strength. It was the ability to observe everything while appearing to absorb nothing. She observed everything. The way Ji-hoon's warmth was perfectly timed. The way the younger man's eyes had not fully settled even after Tae-hyun's 4 words. The way the room carried the pressurized quality of a space in which several people were thinking things they had been told not to say. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the quiet, persistent warmth she still carried in her shin, where a pair of careful hands had rested, a voice that had navigated 25 years of having nothing and surviving it anyway, spoke clearly in the back of her mind. Pay attention, it said. Something in this room is performing kindness. And performance always has a reason. She found it on the 4th day. Not because she was searching, at least, that was what she told herself. She had been walking the estate the way she had learned to move through difficult spaces, quietly, attentively, cataloguing the architecture of her new existence, the same way she had once catalogued exit routes on a restaurant floor. The hanok revealed itself in layers, new corridors behind sliding cedar screens, lower buildings connected to the main structure by stone paths. That morning mist made look painted rather than real, a garden in the eastern courtyard that existed in a quality of silence different from the rest of the estate, the kind of silence that was maintained rather than natural, the kind that told you something lived inside it that was not meant to be found casually. Jenny had noticed it on the 1st day. On the 4th day she followed it, what the vault held. The door was set into the wall behind a panel of dark cedar, the seam almost invisible unless the light caught it at precisely the right angle. It was the light that gave it away. A thin line of warmth bleeding through where the panel met the frame, suggesting a room beyond that was not completely dark. The lock was heavy, mechanical, a combination she had no right to know, but the door swung inward when she pressed it, unlatched, unsealed, as though someone had been here recently and left in the full certainty that no one would follow. Jenny stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The room was small, climate-controlled. The air had a different density inside it, cooler, more deliberate. Shelving lined 2 walls with documents and locked cases she did not examine closely, because her attention had already found the thing at the center of the space. It sat on a standalone shelf at eye level, lit by a single recessed light, the way a museum illuminates something irreplaceable. Nothing beside it, nothing above, nothing to dilute its solitary weight. A denim jacket, dark blue once, faded now in the way of garments that had been handled across years rather than worn. Small, a teenager's size, narrow in the shoulders, the hem worn soft. The scent reached her before her hands did. Something beneath the cedar wood and the cold, climate-controlled air. Faint, buried deep in the weave of the fabric, the kind of thing that bypasses the mind entirely and goes straight to the body. Something about rain, something about concrete and cold and the particular dark of a New York alley. A smell that did not belong in this mountain room at all, and that her lungs recognized with a shock of familiarity before she had any word for why. Her hand moved before she had named what she was remembering. Her fingers found the collar, then the left cuff, worn thin at the edge from how many times she had pushed it up her forearm, and the rough stiffness of the dried stain on the left side, old blood, the color of rust and permanence, the memory crystallized completely. A New York alley, rain coming down sideways, a man bleeding into the concrete who looked up at her, with eyes that didn't expect to see the next morning, her own hands pressing the only coat she owned against a wound, while her heart slammed so hard she could feel it in her jaw. The payphone 2 blocks down, the call, the running, because she was 15 and alone, and the world had never once given her a reason to believe that stopping to help someone would not cost her something. She had run. She had never gone back. She had spent one cold winter without a coat and told herself it was the right thing. She stood in the vault with her fingers on that left cuff, worn thin precisely the way she remembered wearing it thin, and the room tilted. The man behind her. "Don't move." His voice from the doorway. Low, not angry, something far more dangerous than angry. Jenny didn't move. She heard him step into the room, the weight and controlled pace of his footfall, which she had learned in 4 days, the way you learn the sound of weather shifting. And then he was behind her, close enough that the warmth of him pressed against her back. The silence that followed was not empty. It was packed with something that had no name yet and required both of them to stand inside it. "You found it," he said. Not an accusation. A word that carried the texture of inevitability, of something that had been approaching for a very long time and had finally arrived. "Whose is it?" Her voice came out steadier than she deserved, a long beat. The cedarwood and cold air smell of the room held itself around them. "Mine," he said. "It belonged to a girl. I recovered it from a hospital intake record 10 years ago. I have kept it here since." Jenny turned around. It was the first time she had seen him look like something other than the most controlled person in any given space. He stood in the vault doorway with his arms loose at his sides and his face carrying something she had no category for. The professional stillness stripped away, the calculated composure dissolved, the blankness he wore in rooms full of dangerous men completely gone. What remained underneath was older and rawer, and far more frightening for being real. "She was 15, he said, his jaw tightened. "I was 22. I had been shot in an alley off Delancey, and I was dying the way young men die when they have spent their entire lives believing they won't. Alone. Cold. The kind of alone where you start doing arithmetic on your choices." He paused. And then this girl appeared. He looked at the jacket, then back at her. "Small," he said. Natural hair, dark skin. She didn't say much. She pressed her jacket against the wound, and she called an ambulance from down the block. And by the time help arrived, she was gone. She left the only coat she had in the rain, and she disappeared like she had never been there. His voice had dropped to something below conversational, something that lived closer to the ground. "In my world," he said, "that kind of act does not exist. No one gives without wanting something returned. No one stays when staying costs them. I had never in my life encountered it, And it? He stopped. Something passed across his face, grief or the ache of a decade condensing into a single room. I needed to find her. I needed to understand what kind of person does that and asks for nothing. He looked directly at Jenny. I spent 10 years looking. The room was very quiet. Her throat had sealed itself. Her hands were still on the jacket. The worn softness of that left cuff. The scent that had moved through her lungs before her mind could form the question. "Tae-hyun," she said. He looked at her. Her voice broke cleanly in the middle of his name like something that had been holding its shape for too long. "It was me," she said. "What cannot be taken back?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, overfull. The kind that arrives when two people simultaneously understand that everything they thought was coincidence was not coincidence at all, and the architecture of the last 10 years quietly reassembles itself around that understanding, and nothing that came before it can be read the same way again. He crossed the room in 3 steps. His hands came up and held her face, both of them, his palms warm and deliberate against her cheeks, his thumbs moving to the wetness beneath her eyes. Before she had fully registered, she was crying. He held her face the way you hold something you have been searching for so long that the finding of it has not yet become fully real. His eyes moved over her features slowly, not with hunger, not with possession, with the undisguised expression of a man trying to reconcile 10 years of a ghost with the breathing, tearful, living reality standing inside his hands. The tattoos on his fingers were against her jaw. She felt each one. "You ran," he said. "I was 15 and I was alone," she said. "I always ran." "You saved my life," he said. "And then you were gone. I thought—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I thought I had invented you, that the blood loss had given me something to hold on to that wasn't real." Jenny looked at him, at the neck tattoos that had meant nothing on a restaurant stage 4 days ago, at the face of a man who had carried an old denim jacket and an unpaid debt through an entire decade and built an empire around the searching. "You found me," she said. "You found me first," he said. 10 years ago, in the rain. You found me and you left before I could." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The distance between them had always been a fiction. She understood that now, in her body, in the gravity of his hands against her face, and the fiction had simply run out of time. When his mouth found hers, it was nothing like the controlled, impenetrable composure she had been bracing against for 4 days. It was careful at first, almost careful, the restraint of a man who had learned to hold his own strength back. And then something that had been held back for 10 years simply stopped holding. Her fingers found the front of his shirt. His arms came around her, warm, unhurried, absolute, and the vault and its solitary light and the blood-stained jacket and the decade of searching were all still present, all still entirely real. But the distance was gone, and the cedarwood smell of the room folded around them both, like it had always been built for exactly this. Tae-hyun left on the 3rd morning after the vault. He didn't announce it the night before. There was no careful conversation, no soft preparation. There was simply the sound of movement before dawn, the purposeful quality of someone assembling themselves for war. And then he appeared in the doorway of her room fully dressed, suit jacket on, the composed mask already back in place, over everything the vault had briefly uncovered. Jenny was awake. She had been awake for an hour, lying in the dark listening to the mountain silence and trying to decide what she was now, in the aftermath of a kiss that had rearranged the furniture of everything she thought she understood about her situation. He looked at her from the doorway. "There is business that cannot wait," he said. 3 days, possibly 4. She sat up. The borrowed silk of her sleep clothes settled against her dark skin in the low light, and she watched him the way she had learned to watch him, carefully, without appearing to. "And while you're gone?" she asked. Ji-hoon will ensure your safety. A pause so brief most people would have missed it. You will want for nothing. He held her gaze for one long moment, the kind that carried more than words were being used to say, and then he was gone. The sound of the helicopter followed 10 minutes later, rising from somewhere beyond the eastern courtyard and moving away through the mountain dark until the silence folded back over the estate like nothing had disturbed it. Jenny sat in the quiet and pressed 2 fingers to her own lips. Then she got up and got dressed and decided to pay very close attention to everything. The kind Uncle Ji-hoon's warmth arrived with the morning. He found her in the main courtyard after breakfast. Jenny in a dark quilted coat, hands wrapped around a ceramic cup, watching the mist move through the lower gardens, with the attentiveness of someone who had learned to read environments for what they were, rather than what they presented. He came bearing tea, a different variety from the breakfast blend, pale gold, fragrant, served in a cup that communicated refinement. He sat across from her with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere to be, and all the time required to be gracious about it. The tea was beautiful. She lifted it to her mouth. The first sip landed on her tongue with a faint bitterness underneath the floral. Subtle, a back note, the kind that arrived after the warmth had already moved down your throat. And you were deciding whether you'd imagined it. She set the cup down after one sip. Tae-hyun trusts you completely, Jenny said, conversational, eyes on the garden. We are family, Ji-hoon said, with the particular warmth of someone who understood the word's power. He has no one else. That creates a bond that goes beyond trust. She nodded, said nothing. The silence was his opening. He is a complicated man to love, Ji-hoon said, gently, almost paternally. His world requires certain things, continuity, legacy, a line that carries forward. Jenny kept her face entirely still. I only say this, Ji-hoon continued, his voice softening further into something that performed concern the way skilled actors perform grief, because I have watched him carry things that were never meant for one person. A man in his position requires more than a companion. He requires security, the kind that only certain things can provide. He let that settle. Then, you are a remarkable woman, Miss Derrick. I mean that honestly. But remarkable and suitable are not always the same category. There it was. Jenny looked at him for the first time in the conversation, directly, fully, the way she had learned to look at things she was deciding whether to be afraid of. You're talking about children, she said. He spread his hands with a diplomatic sadness of someone delivering a regret they had not manufactured. I am talking about what his enemies will use against him. A man without an heir is a man whose empire dies with him. That is a vulnerability, and in our world, vulnerability is an invitation. I see, she said. She picked up the tea, lifted it to her lips, and set it back down without drinking. Thank you for your honesty, she said. She smiled. He smiled back. Neither smile reached anything real. What? She noticed Jenny had learned young that the most valuable education was the one nobody realized they were giving you. She began watching Ji-hoon's security detail that afternoon. Not obviously, not from positions that announced themselves as surveillance. She watched from windows, from the periphery of rooms, from the invisibility that 25 years of being overlooked had made second nature in her. The first thing she noticed, 3 of Ji-hoon's men had rotated off their posts during Tae-yoon's departure window. Not sequentially, simultaneously, replaced by faces she had not seen in the estate before. Harder faces, with the stillness of men whose loyalty had been recently transferred rather than long established. The second thing, Ji-hoon's private satellite phone. She had seen him use it twice in the main corridor, not the house line, not the encrypted communications system that Tae-hyun's staff used. A separate device, produced from an inside pocket with the ease of long habit. Both times the conversation ended the moment he registered proximity. The third thing, the eastern gate had been left accessible. Not unlocked, that would have been careless, And Ji-hoon was not careless. But the security rotation that should have doubled at the gate during Tae-hoon's absence had instead thinned. One guard where protocol required 3, and that single guard faced inward. Not watching for threats coming in, watching for people trying to get out. Jenny stood in the upper corridor and felt the cold sweat of understanding move across the back of her neck.
She went to find a phone.
The house line gave her nothing. Dead tone, not disconnected but jammed, which was a deliberate and specific distinction. The encrypted system that Tae-yoon's staff used to reach him flashed a connection signal that cycled and never resolved. One of the younger staff members she had grown careful with over 4 days looked at her with an expression that lasted only a second. A flicker of something very close to apology before his face went professionally blank. Jenny walked back to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and she breathed slowly, and she thought with the cold, methodical precision of a woman who had survived every previous version of having no options. Ji-hoon was the leak, the warmth, the access, the satellite phone, the redeployed guards, the eastern gate left thin. This was not preparation for defense. This was preparation for delivery. And she, Jenny Derrick, barren American waitress, the woman Ji-hoon had spent 3 days trying to convince was worthless, was what was being prepared for delivery. The tea, 1 sip and set down. She thought about that. She was very glad she had only taken 1 sip. Outside, the mountain dark was coming in early. The mist from the lower gardens had thickened. The estate that had felt ancient and quiet and almost safe 4 days ago now had the atmosphere of a room in which something had already been decided, and the only question remaining was timing. Jenny looked at the window, at the mountains beyond it, at the last thin line of light dying at the ridge. She had survived 25 years with nothing and no one. She had pressed her jacket against a stranger's chest in the rain because something in her had refused, even then, to walk past a thing that needed her. She was not going to be delivered to anyone, but she needed to think fast, because somewhere on the other side of a communications blackout, the most dangerous man she had ever trusted was unreachable. And the clock that had been running since Ji-hoon sat down with his beautiful, bitter tea had just gotten very loud. The storm arrived before the men did. Jenny had been watching the weather build since late afternoon. The way the mountain sky darkened from the west, with a purposeful density that felt less like weather and more like cover. She had seen enough of the world's indifference to recognize when something natural was being used as a tool. She moved through the estate in the hour before dark with quiet urgency, memorizing the layout of every corridor she had walked in 4 days, placing the rooms against each other, in her mind, the way you arrange pieces on a board before the game begins. She had found the servant passages by accident on the 2nd day and had said nothing about it. Old corridors behind the main walls, narrow, unlit, smelling of cedar and age, connecting the kitchen quarters to the receiving rooms to the upper residential wing. Built for invisibility, for the kind of people the estate's history had always needed but never acknowledged. She memorized every one of them. By the time the storm broke over the mountain in earnest, rain like static, thunder that moved through the wooden walls of the hanok the way sound moves through bone. Jenny was already dressed in dark clothes, her natural hair pulled back tight against her head, sitting on the floor of her room, with her back against the wall and her eyes on the door. She was afraid. She was also completely, coldly awake. When the screens shattered, they came at 11. The first sound was wrong. Not the storm, not the estate settling in the cold, but something beneath it, directional, deliberate, the crack of ancient wooden screens giving way under weight applied from outside. Then the shouting, in 2 languages, and the percussive violence of gunfire that turned the mountain quiet into something unrecognizable. Jenny was already moving. She didn't run for the main corridor. She pressed the panel behind the wardrobe and slid into the servant passage and pulled it shut behind her, and stood in the absolute dark, breathing through her nose, counting to 3, forcing her heart rate down the way she had learned through years of surviving things that required her to be smaller and quieter than her fear. The passage smelled of cedar and cold stone. She moved through it with one hand on the wall, fast but silent, the sounds of the breach filtering through the walls around her. Boots on marble, the shattering of something ceramic and irreplaceable, a voice issuing commands in clipped American English that had the quality of men being paid, rather than men with loyalty. She was nearly to the junction that split toward the kitchen when she heard the crying. Small, suppressed, the sound of someone trying very hard to make no sound at all. Jenny stopped. She pressed her ear to the wall panel. Calculated. 3 seconds. She pressed it open. The young maid, Sua, 19 years old, who had brought Jenny breakfast every morning, with the careful deference of someone new to a position she needed and a shy smile she hadn't been able to fully suppress, was crouched behind the kitchen preparation counter with her, hands over her mouth and her eyes wide with a terror so pure it stripped everything else from her face. She looked at Jenny the way people look at the only solid thing in a room that is moving. Jenny crossed to her without hesitation, got down, put one hand on the girl's shoulder, firm, steady, the way you anchor someone who is about to go under. Passage behind the panel, Jenny said, barely a sound. Now, stay close, do not stop moving. Sua stared at her. Now, Jenny said again, quiet as a held breath and twice as absolute. The girl moved. The courtyard. They made it through 2 junctions before the passage ended, the old corridor terminating at a wooden door that opened onto the bow, eastern courtyard, and Jenny pushed through it with Sua behind her and pulled up hard at the sight ahead. The estate was burning. Not all of it. Not yet. The western wing, where the documents were, where Taehyun's office sat behind its heavy door. Orange light was climbing the ancient wood with the patient, catastrophic efficiency of fire that had been deliberately set. The smoke came low and fast across the courtyard stone, and the rain hammered down onto all of it without making any difference at all. Jenny turned. The gate behind them, the eastern gate, the one with the thinned security, the one she had noticed 3 days ago, was sealed. 2 men stood at it now, facing inward. The passage exit behind her was already blocked, a figure emerging through the door she had just come through, forcing Sua against Jenny's back. Nowhere left. She pushed Sua behind her and turned to face the courtyard fully, and the smoke shifted, and Ji-hoon walked out of it. He moved without urgency. His suit was immaculate, despite everything happening around him. The warmth was gone from his face completely, the way warmth disappears when the performance that required it has ended. What remained underneath was older and more absolute than anything she had seen from him across a tea service. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. "You are more difficult than I anticipated," he said. His English was precise, as always. The paternalism, at least, was gone. "That is a compliment, Miss Derrick. I want you to know that." Jenny stood in the firelight with the rain soaking through her dark clothes and her natural hair plastered to her face. And she breathed, and she kept her body between Ji-hoon and the girl pressed against her back, and she did not look at the fire, or the blocked gate, or any of the several armed men now materializing at the courtyard's edges. She looked at Ji-hoon. "You were never going to let him keep me," she said. "He was never going to keep anything," Ji-hoon said. "But you first." The smoke rolled between them. The ancient wood of the estate cracked and groaned against the fire eating it. The rain fell on everything equally, on the burning and the standing, on the guilty and the cornered, with the complete indifference of weather that has no stake in outcomes. Jenny felt the heat of the fire against her left side, felt Sua's hands gripping the back of her jacket with both fists, felt the clarifying cold of a moment in which there were no good options left, and the only question was which version of bad she could survive. She had been 15 years old in a dark alley with nothing. She had pressed her jacket against a bleeding stranger and called for help and run. She was not 15 anymore, and this time she had no intention of running. Ji-hoon took one step toward her. Jenny held her ground. She had nothing in her hands, no weapon, no advantage, no exit. She had the fire to her left and armed men at every perimeter, and a 19-year-old girl pressed against her back, with both fists locked in the fabric of her jacket. She had the cold rain on her face and the smoke burning the back of her throat, and the fury of a woman who had spent her entire life being told she was not enough and had decided, in this courtyard, in this fire, that she was done with that particular story. Ji-hoon read something in her expression. He paused. Not from fear, from the mild professional curiosity of a man recalibrating the difficulty of a task. "You have nowhere to go," he said. "I know," Jenny said. "Then why?" The sound arrived before the light did. A low, rhythmic percussion building from the northeast. Felt in the chest before it was heard by the ears, the mechanical heartbeat of a helicopter moving fast and low through mountain weather, that had no business being navigated at this altitude, in this storm. Every armed man in the courtyard shifted their eyes upward. Then the spotlight hit, blinding, surgical, a column of white light dropping from the dark sky directly into the courtyard, and Jenny's breath left her body in a single hard exhale. Because she had stood inside a spotlight once before, under circumstances she would spend the rest of her life measuring everything else against, and that light had also arrived at the exact moment she had run out of anything left to lose. The helicopter didn't land. Tae-hyun dropped from it. The boss comes home. He came down on a fast line, hit the courtyard stone in a single controlled impact, and was moving before the dust settled. Tactical vest over dark clothes, a weapon in each hand, the tattoos on his neck and forearms fully visible beneath the rolled sleeves, his face carrying the expression of a man who had spent an entire flight calculating exactly what he was going to do when he landed, and was now doing. He did not look like anger. Anger was loud and reactive and wasted itself. What Tae-hyun brought into that courtyard was something colder and more total. The quiet, lethal folks of a man who had been kept from something he considered his, and was correcting that situation now, with complete precision and no interest in negotiation. The first two of Ji-hoon's men went down before they had fully processed that he was there. Ji-hoon took 3 steps back into the smoke. Jenny pulled Suar with her toward the estate wall, away from the open center, pressing them both flat against the ancient stone that was warm now, on the other side from the fire consuming the western wing. She watched Tae-hyun move through the courtyard the way she watched everything she needed to understand, with total, unblinking attention. He was extraordinary in the way that dangerous things are extraordinary when you see them operating at full capacity. Every movement economical, every decision made at a speed that made decision appear like instinct. 3 of Ji-hoon's men converged from the east side, and he went through them with a controlled brutality that was almost geometric. The angles calculated, the force exactly sufficient, nothing wasted on performance. But there were more men than angles, and he had not seen the one coming from the north. The Greys. The shot came from the upper walkway of the estate's north face, a mercenary positioned there before the helicopter arrived, who had the patience and the training to wait for a clear line rather than rushing into the chaos below. Tae-hyun was shielding Jenny. He had crossed the courtyard to her position in the space between one breath and the next, one hand catching her arm, pulling her further against the wall, putting the breadth of his body between her and the open center of the courtyard. And the bullet that found him in that moment was not the bullet that had been meant for her. It took him across the left side, high, grazing. She saw him absorb it, saw the half-second flinch he suppressed almost immediately, saw the way his jaw locked and his grip on her arm tightened as the impact registered, and was filed away as manageable. He did not go down. He turned immediately, weapon up, returned fire to the walkway, and the mercenary above them dropped. But the turning had opened his left side, and the turning had cost him his awareness of the perimeter, and the man moving in from the northwest, fast, low, tactical, was inside Tai-hun's blind spot before either of them registered him. Jenny saw him first. The second save 10 years ago, she had pressed her jacket against a wound in the rain. She had saved him by instinct, because something in her at 15 had refused to walk past a dying thing, regardless of the cost. She had not known his name. She had not known what he was, or what he would become, or what any of it would mean, when it circled back around to find her in a restaurant with a microphone. She had just acted. She acted now. The shattered remains of a ceramic garden vessel lay at the base of the estate wall. Ancient blue and white porcelain, split when the fire's heat had expanded the stone around it. The largest fragment, the length of her forearm, with an edge that the firelight made look forged rather than broken. She had it in her hand before the conscious choice arrived. The edge bit into her palm. She felt it distantly, the way you feel things that are happening to your body while your mind is somewhere else entirely. The mercenary was 4 feet from Tai-hun's blind side and closing. Jenny stepped out from the wall and drove the shattered edge across his face. She would not remember the sound he made. What she would remember was the weight of the fragment, the resistance, the way her arm followed through with everything she had, all of it, every last ounce of what it had cost to carry herself this far alone. The man went down. Tai-hun spun. He looked at her, standing in the firelight in the rain with her dark skin gleaming with water and smoke and her hand bleeding where the shard had cut into her palm, her chest heaving, her eyes on the man on the ground. And something moved across his face that had no name in any operational language. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps, and his hands were on her face, and her bleeding hand, and her arms, checking, cataloguing. The field assessment of a man making sure something vital was intact. And when he found her whole and standing, the breath that left him was not tactical. It was human. You. He started. Twice, she said. Her voice came out rough from the smoke. That's twice now. He looked at her for one long moment in the firelight and the rain. Then his arm came around her shoulders, not gently, not carefully, but with the anchor-weight certainty of someone who had decided that proximity was no longer optional, and he turned them both toward the estates. Northeast exit, his weapon still up, his body still between her and every remaining line of fire. How he knew, she asked him later, in the mountain safe house, while the medic worked on his left side and the dark pressed against the windows. The communications blackout, she said. How did you know to come back? He was quiet for a moment. Kwon, he said. She placed the name, one of his personal guards, older, quiet, who had traveled with Tai-hun's own detail rather than the estate's staff. Ji-hoon had reassigned every man inside his reach. Kwon had never been inside his reach. When the blackout dropped, Kwon recognized the pattern, Tai-hun said. He drove through the night to reach my secondary contact. A pause. He found us 6 hours before you were in that courtyard. Jenny looked at the window. 6 hours. The entire gap between Ji-hoon's plan, succeeding and failing, had been one loyal man and a car in the mountain. Dark. She said nothing. She filed it away. In the world she was learning to live in, that kind of arithmetic mattered. What burns Ji-hoon was gone. Not dead. Jenny understood that even through the smoke and the adrenaline. Gone in the way of men who plan retreats before they require them, who build exits into every room they enter, and use them without sentimentality when the math stops working in their favor. He had run back to his American partners. She was certain of it. Tai-hun's arm was still around her as they moved through the northeast passage, and out through the gate his men had already secured, the estate burning behind them against the dark mountain sky. Not the silence of relief between them. The silence of a calculation being completed, a next move taking shape. Suar emerged from the passage behind them. Jenny had kept hold of her through the chaos with a grip that left no room for negotiation, and when the girl stumbled on the wet stone outside the gate, Jenny caught her without thinking and held on until she steadied. The young maid looked up at her with an expression that required no translation. Jenny held her gaze, nodded once. "You're safe," she said. "Stay close." They kept moving. Tae-hyun's hand found the small of Jenny's back in the dark. The same place it had been in the restaurant, on the night that started all of this, guiding her through chaos towards something that hadn't yet revealed its shape. She felt it through the wet fabric of her jacket, felt the warmth of him against the cold of the mountain night. She felt, underneath the fear and the smoke and the bleeding palm and the adrenaline still burning through her system, the same thing she had felt in a vault 3 days ago in a room that smelled like cedarwood. She was not invisible. She was not alone. And the man beside her, bleeding through his tactical vest, jaw set, already planning the next move, had crossed a communications blackout and a mountain storm and a courtyard on fire to be here. He hadn't come for his empire. He had come for her. The fire behind them lit the mountain sky amber and orange and terrible, and they walked away from it together, and Ji-hoon was still out there somewhere in the dark. But tonight, they were alive. And tomorrow, they were going back to New York. They flew back to New York on the second day. Tae-hyun's wound had been cleaned and closed by the time the jet was wheels up. A field dressing, precise and efficient, applied in the mountain safe house by a medic who worked with the practiced silence of someone long accustomed to not asking questions about the injuries he was treating. Jenny had sat across from Tae-hyun during it, with her own bandaged hand in her lap, watching his face, cataloguing every micro-expression he suppressed each time the medic pressed against the wound. He did not make a sound. She had expected that. What she had not expected was that he spent the entire procedure watching her back. Not with the clinical assessment of a man monitoring variables, but with the attention of someone who had nearly lost something and was taking inventory of its continued existence. Neither of them said much on the flight. They didn't need to. The plan had been assembled in the safe house in the hours after the fire, laid out across a table with the same focused precision Tae-hyun brought to everything that mattered. And Jenny had sat across from him and listened and contributed and watched the syndicate lieutenants who had survived Ji-hoon's purge adjust visibly and without comment to the reality of her presence at that table. Not as a guest, not as a liability, as a variable they needed to account for. She had noticed the shift. She had said nothing about it. She had simply continued thinking, because the plan required thinking, and she was better at it than most people in the room had yet fully understood. The plan itself required time, not the blunt instrument of immediate force, but the kind of patient preparation that Ji-hoon had always underestimated in others, because he trusted too fully in the speed of his own betrayal to imagine that it could be turned back against him with equal precision. Communication logs had to be decoded and distributed to the right hands. Financial transfers had to be traced to their origin. Flight schedule leaks had to be mapped against the timeline of every security breach in the syndicate's American operations over the preceding 18 months. Most critically, Ji-hoon himself had to be drawn back to New York, to a meeting he would believe was a renegotiation, offered terms designed to appeal to his assessment of his own leverage. He needed to arrive believing he had already won. It took 4 weeks. Jenny spent those weeks learning the shape of the world she had stepped into, watching everything, trusting carefully and strategically, and waiting for the moment with the patience of a woman who had spent a lifetime understanding that timing was the only resource the powerless fully controlled. On the morning of the 28th day, when Tae-hyun's team confirmed that Ji-hoon and his American partners had accepted the summons, she dressed in silk for the first time in her life and went to a restaurant she had once cleared plates in without being looked at. The ground it started on it looked the same from the outside. Same awning. Same discreet door that didn't announce itself. Same carefully maintained indifference of a place that had learned prosperity was best protected by appearing unremarkable. Jenny stood on the sidewalk outside it, in the New York night with the city's cold November air, moving through her natural hair and her dark coat, and looked at the entrance and felt the weight of returning to a place that had broken something in her, and understanding that the breaking had been the beginning. Tae-hyun stood beside her. He had said nothing when the car stopped. He had simply looked at her and waited, with the patience of a man who understood that this moment belonged to her, and his role was proximity. The faint set of his jaw was the only indication that the wound in his left side had not finished registering its objection to the evening's requirements. "Ready," she said. It was not a question. They went in. The underground room, the boardroom beneath the restaurant, had been sealed before Ji-hoon understood what was happening. That was the elegance of it. The plan had no announcement, no warning, no theatrical declaration of intent. Tae-hyun's people had moved through the syndicate's global network in the 4 weeks since the Hanok fire, with the efficiency of a system built to operate exactly this way. Evidence distributed, alliances tested, loyalties confirmed and betrayals catalogued. Ji-hoon had been summoned under the pretense of a renegotiation, terms that spoke directly to his calculation of his own position, framed to convince him that the balance of power was still in his favor. He had come because he believed he had already won. By the time he descended the kitchen stairs into the underground boardroom, the exits had been closed for 2 hours. The walls were mahogany, dark and close. The table long enough to communicate that the people seated at it made decisions measured in human lives. Crystal glasses, untouched. The air cold and still, the way air sits in rooms that have been prepared rather than inhabited. 12 men were seated when Jenny and Tae-hyun entered. Ji-hoon was among them. He looked at Jenny with an expression she would remember for a long time. Not the warmth, which was gone, and not the cold calculation from the courtyard, which had served its purpose. What she saw on his face in the moment he registered her presence at that door, alive and standing and accompanied, was something more fundamental than either. It was the compressing horror of a man who has spent considerable effort arranging for a particular outcome and is now looking directly at its failure. She held his gaze. She did not look away. The proof Tae-hyun moved to the head of the table. He did not sit. He stood and reached into the interior of his jacket and produced a drive which he set down without ceremony, and then a document, and then a second, and then a third. Each item placed with the unhurried precision of a man who has assembled this particular argument with care and intends it to be understood completely. He spoke for 11 minutes. Jenny stood to his right, slightly back, and watched the faces around the table as the evidence was laid out. Communication logs from Ji-hoon's satellite phone, time-stamped against every major security breach in the syndicate's American operations over 18 months. Financial transfers traced back to the American faction, running through shell accounts Ji-hoon had believed were invisible. The floor manager, Marcus Webb, paid 6 weeks before the restaurant incident, contacted by Ji-hoon's American partners with a single instruction: put the waitress on the stage and keep her there while a sniper took position across the street. And the sniper himself sent on Ji-hoon's intelligence about Tae-hyun's precise location that evening, targeting the chair that Tae-hyun had vacated, the moment a broken girl on a stage made him stand up. The full architecture of that night now spread across a mahogany table under unforgiving light. Every piece of it intentional, every piece of it traceable back to one man. Her confession had moved Tae-hyun from his chair, and moving him had saved his life, and the people who had arranged for that chair to be the last place he ever sat were now sitting in the same room as the proof of what they had done. The faces around the table did not shift dramatically. These were men trained to receive catastrophic information without performing their response. But she had spent 2 years reading rooms for a living, and she read this one. By the 4th document, the men who had been Ji-hoon's allies were looking at the table instead of at Tae-hyun. By the 7th, Ji-hoon's American partners were looking at Ji-hoon. By the 11th minute, no one in that room was looking at Ji-hoon except Jenny. The silence that followed Tae-hyun's last word had the weight of a verdict reached by 12 people simultaneously without a single one of them. Saying so out loud, Ji-hoon looked at Tae-hyun. "You would execute your own blood," he said. His voice was controlled, almost. "You executed my trust," Tae-hyun said. "The blood is a separate accounting." Then he turned, and he looked at Jenny. The pen he reached into his jacket and produced it, gilded, heavy, the kind of object that communicated its own significance in the weight of it. He set it on the mahogany table between them with the deliberate movement of a man making a statement that required no words. Beside it he placed the deed. Ji-hoon's assets, his accounts, his properties, his operational territories, every material thing he had built across 4 decades of calculated ambition, reduced to 2 pages of paper on a boardroom table at the end of a story that had started with a sniper's bullet and a girl on a stage. Tae-hyun stepped back. He gave her the space. He gave her the room. He gave her, with the full weight of everything he commanded and everything he was, the power. Without condition, without qualification, without the need to explain what it meant that he was doing this or why. She understood why. Jenny Derrick stepped forward. She was 25 years old. She had a healing cut on her palm and smoke still somewhere in her hair, and a bandage on a knee that a man with careful hands had dressed in a penthouse that seemed like a different lifetime. She had stood on a stage in this building and told a room full of monsters that she was barren and alone and worth nothing. She picked up the pen. Ji-hoon looked at her. Something moved across his face, a last attempt at the warmth, muscle memory reaching for the performance that had always worked. And then he looked at her eyes and stopped. "You have no idea what you are stepping into," he said. "I've been stepping into things with nothing my entire life," Jenny said. Her voice was completely level, the voice of a woman who had stopped being afraid of rooms. "The difference now is I'm not doing it alone." She looked at the document. She looked at the pen. She signed. The sound of the nib crossing paper in the heavy silence of that underground room was the quietest thing that had happened since the spotlight, and the most final. When she set the pen down, Tae-hyun's hand found hers on the table, not urgently, not theatrically, but with the simple, unhurried certainty of a man completing a gesture he had been building toward for 10 years. Ji-hoon was escorted from the room. He did not leave the building. The men around the table, one by one, in the measured sequence of a world reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity, acknowledged what had just occurred, not with applause, not with words, with the weighted silence of men who understood that the queen had been crowned, and that crowns in this world were not given. They were taken. The word spread the way things spread in the underworld, not through announcements or press releases, but through the efficient language of absence. Ji-hoon's name stopped appearing in communications. His properties transferred quietly. His allies, one by one, realigned without ceremony, because men who survive in that world develop an instinct for the direction gravity is moving and the intelligence to move with it. The American faction that had sent a sniper to the restaurant, the faction that had funded a betrayal and ordered a kidnapping and burned an ancient hanok against a Korean mountain, went silent with the totality of organizations that have assessed a threat and decided that survival requires stillness. Taehyun's empire didn't expand in those weeks. It consolidated, which, in that world, was more final. And beside him, at every table that mattered, in every room where the future of the Baeko syndicate was decided, Jenny Derrick sat, not as decoration, not as symbol, as the woman who had signed the document, who had walked into the boardroom of the place that had broken her and left it, carrying the deed to a dead man's empire, who had saved the boss's life twice in 2 completely different decades and asked for nothing either time. The global underworld is not a world that respects weakness, but it has always, in its oldest and most honest traditions, respected the kind of strength that does not announce itself until it is required. Jenny had never announced herself. She didn't start now. What BARREN grows the foundation was Tae-hyun's idea. The structure of it was Jenny's. She had been in his office in the New York penthouse. 3 weeks after the boardroom, the city cold and grey outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, when she laid the proposal across his desk with the same quiet certainty she had, brought to everything since the night she stopped running. Street children, orphaned youth, both continents, a network of highly secured residential facilities, each one staffed, funded, protected under the full operational umbrella of the Baco Syndicate's legitimate holdings. She had stood on a stage in this city and said the word, "Barren," into a microphone and felt the room laugh. She had meant it as a confession of deficit. She understood now that she had been describing something else entirely. Not emptiness as loss, but emptiness as capacity, space that had not yet found its purpose. Room waiting to be filled with something that mattered. The foundation was its purpose. Tae-hun looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at her. "How many?" he asked. "As many as needed," she said. He picked up his pen and signed the funding allocation, without another word. The amount was significant. She did not flinch at it. She took the document, reviewed it, and began making calls. That was how it started. By spring, the first facility opened in Seoul, a converted compound in the Mapo district, warm and fortified, and full of the organized chaos of children who had been given safety for the first time, and were discovering, cautiously, what safety permitted them to be. By summer, 2 more opened. One in Brooklyn, one in the Itaewon neighborhood of Seoul's eastern quarter, close enough to the ancestral estate's rebuilt grounds that Jenny could drive between them in 20 minutes. The hanok itself had been restored over the winter. The same dark wood, the same curved-edge roof lines that swept upward like a held breath, the same pale stone courtyards. Tae-hyun had overseen every detail personally. It was a statement the rebuilding made on his behalf, quieter and more permanent than anything spoken aloud. What is ours is not so easily erased. Soo-ah, the young maid who had gripped the back of Jenny's jacket with both fists in a burning courtyard, became the first Korean staff member Jenny brought into the Foundation's Seoul operation. She ran the morning programs for the youngest children, with a focused, unsentimental warmth that reminded Jenny sometimes of herself. They never spoke about the fire directly. They didn't need to. Some things were understood more completely in their silence than they ever could have been in words. The children learned Jenny's name before they learned the name of the organization that housed them, which was exactly how she intended it. The matriarch's name they called her Ioma in Seoul, Mom in Brooklyn, Miss Jenny everywhere else, until they knew her well enough to drop the miss. She was 25 years old, and she was the mother of dozens, and the word barren, the word that Ji-hoon had tried to use as a weapon, the word she had sobbed into a microphone in a restaurant full of people who were supposed to be her worst night, had simply ceased to mean anything useful. What it had been replaced with was this: a 15-year-old girl in Seoul who had not spoken in 4 months, who sat across from Jenny one afternoon in a common room, and watched her with the measuring silence of a child who has learned that adults are assessed before they are trusted, and then, without announcement, climbed into the chair beside her and leaned her small head against Jenny's shoulder and went to sleep. Jenny had sat very still. She had looked at the wall, at the winter light coming through the secured window, at the impossible, specific weight of a child who had chosen her. She had not moved for 2 hours. When she told Tae-hyun that evening, his face did the thing it had done in the vault. The thing underneath the composure, older and rawer, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Her name?" "Minji," Jenny said. He nodded. "Good name," he said. The Balcony spring arrived in New York with the insistent optimism of a city that has survived another winter and considers this an achievement worth celebrating. The penthouse balcony caught the morning sun from the east, and the city below was already in motion, the deep, layered hum of it rising to where they stood. Jenny leaned against the railing with a coffee she hadn't finished, the sun warm on her dark skin, her natural hair loose around her shoulders The way she wore it now in the mornings before the day required anything of her. The scar on her palm caught the light, pale against her brown skin, fully healed, shaped by the decision she had made in a burning courtyard with a piece of ancient pottery and everything she had. A reminder, not a wound. She had long since stopped thinking of it as the latter. Tae-hyun came to stand behind her. He moved the way he always moved, without announcement, without performance. And his presence at her back was the warmth of something that had stopped being surprising and become, instead, structural. His hands found her shoulders, his chin lowered to the top of her head. For a long moment they stood there in the morning light, with the city moving, below them, and said nothing. Because nothing required saying, because silence between them had long since stopped being empty. "You're thinking about Minji," he said. "I'm thinking about all of them," she said. His arms came around her from behind, unhurried, entirely certain, and she felt the length of him against her back, the warmth of his chest, the stillness in him that she had once catalogued as dangerous and now understood as simply his. "You told a room full of strangers you had nothing," he said. His voice was low, close to her ear, the register he used only when no one else was present. "That you were empty." She looked at the city, at the light on the water far to the south, at the morning expanding over everything they had survived to reach. "I was," she said honestly. "No." His lips touched the side of her head, soft, deliberate, then against her temple, then against the scar on her palm when he lifted her hand and turned it gently in his. "You were waiting," he said. "There is a difference." Jenny felt something move through her that had no single name. Gratitude and grief and triumph and love, all occupying the same space simultaneously, the way things do when you have survived enough to understand that the complicated feelings are the real ones. She turned in his arms. His face in the morning light was familiar now in the way that mattered. Not just recognized, but known. The tattoos, the jaw, the eyes that had looked at her from across a restaurant and seen something that every other room had looked straight through. "We have a board meeting at 9, she said. "I know," he said. "And Minji has her language assessment at 11. "I know," he said again. His hand moved to her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with the unhurried certainty of someone who intended to keep doing this for a very long time. "Tae-hyun," she said. "Jenny," he said back. The way he said her name, like it was a complete sentence, like it was the resolution to every preceding clause, had never once stopped landing in her chest. The city hummed below them. Somewhere across the water, in a secured compound in Brooklyn, a child who had been found in a stairwell was waking up to her third consecutive morning of safety, which was 3 more than she'd had before Jenny Derrick decided that her empty spaces were not deficits. They were capacity, room for everything that mattered. Tae-hyun's arms tightened. The morning light held them both, and Jenny Derrick, who had stood on a stage with nothing and confessed her emptiness to a world that laughed, pressed her face against the chest of the most dangerous man in 2 continents and felt, finally and completely, and without the shadow of a single doubt, the full, unbreakable weight of being chosen. Not despite everything, because of it. The city kept moving. The story was just beginning. And that is where we leave them. Jenny Derrick. A waitress who walked onto that stage with nothing and walked off it into the most dangerous love story on 2 continents. A woman whose deepest wound became her greatest power. If this story moved something in you, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because more stories like this one are coming, and you do not want to miss them. Drop a comment and tell me which moment broke you open. And tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this dark romance has traveled. Jenny was told she was barren. She became the mother of an empire. See you in the next one.